Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. Today, my guest is one of my heroes. Medea Benjamin is an American political activist who is a co-founder of Code Pink, a women-led organization working to end U.S. wars, militarism, support peace and human rights, and calls for dollars to be directed to life-affirming programs. She's also a founding member of the fair trade advocacy group Global Exchange. She was the Green Party candidate in California in 2000 for United States Senate, receiving the highest raw vote total for any Green Party U.S. Senate candidate. She's a recipient of numerous awards and has campaigned vigorously on labor rights and on corporate responsibility, Israel and Palestine, the Iraq War, drone warfare, Afghanistan, World Trade Organization, and many, many other issues. It would take too long to describe all the amazing achievements of this extraordinary and dynamic woman who has become the bane of right-wing politicians. I'm pleased to catch Medea at a moment when she isn't denouncing politicians in public meetings, being hauled out by thuggish men who try to prevent her speaking truth to power, or being arrested. Welcome, Medea. It's really nice to have you on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Where are you at the moment, Medea? I mean, you are always moving.
I have been spending this time of lockdown in Miami, where we're part of a lovely urban farm in Little Haiti. So I can't complain. The weather is nice. We have a community around here, and it's a very good place if we have to be stuck in our homes.
In our homes. And that's, yes. So, I mean, what I thought would be quite helpful to get your perspective on is the impact of the Trump regime's policy. People never always talk about the Trump government or the Trump or the White House. I like to call it the regime. What their policies are in relation to COVID, both nationally and internationally. Perhaps we look at what the impact has been in the U.S.
The COVID pandemic has really exposed what had already exists, but many people do not want to acknowledge how deep it is in our society, which is the racism. When we look at who is being affected, it's majority people of color, both the Black community, the indigenous community here. It also exposes the class system. While we say that the pandemic affects everybody, it affects people in different ways. People who have access to healthcare, people who have had access to healthcare for years are in much better shape and have stronger immune systems than other people do. Poverty oftentimes leads to many diseases, including asthma, which is something that affects the Black community to a great extent because of the climate degradation. The majority of the sites in this country that are called things like Cancer Alley, where the refineries are, where the coal plants are, these tend to be in poor communities. So it has certainly exposed poverty, racism, and it's exposed the dysfunctionality of what is hard to even call a healthcare system in this country. We don't have any kind of national healthcare system. We have a dystopian kind of healthcare setup that includes a private system for those who have access to private healthcare, a Medicare system for those who are elderly, a Medicaid system for those who are poor, but none of it works well. And it shows up at times like this when we're not able to have a national response to even get the right equipment, basic things like masks, to all of the people who need them. So I think these are some of the things that have become clear when you look at how this pandemic has affected us here in the United States.
But the policies of the government now apparently moving towards releasing the lockdown, changing things to go back to so-called normal. It seems to be that it's informed by a lack of care for those who are most affected, that some people even talk about a eugenics policy. I mean, whether that's intentional or not, the effect appears to be that. What's your view of that?
Well, it's already been happening to a certain extent, because when you see who are the quote essential workers, or who are people who have continued working during this time, it's not just the very heroic healthcare workers, but it's also in the lower paid sectors of society, particularly the farm workers, the people who grow and pick the crops that we need to keep food on our tables. It's the domestic workers. It's people in these nursing homes. It's the people who pick up the garbage, the janitors who clean the offices, the people who are working in the very unhealthy meatpacking plants. These are all poor sectors of our society, oftentimes, but not exclusively, people of color. But they have been forced to continue working under very dire circumstances, and they're the ones who are getting sick at a much higher rate than people in higher paid jobs, people who have been able to have the luxury of working at home.
So in what way are women in particular being affected in this situation?
I can just see in my own family and among my friends, my daughters, for example, who suddenly have to, on top of all the other things that they do in terms of keeping their work, and they are lucky to be able to keep their jobs and work from home, but have the added childcare has been quite extraordinary for them. And this is another full-time job to add into already full-time work, as well as household work, which has become more difficult. And when I look and see what's happening to women in society in general, my daughters are fortunate enough to have partners, but many women are single heads of households. I have friends who have been having a very, very tough time. And it also affects them mentally, because it is depressing to be working so hard day and night, see no end in sight, wondering how we're ever going to get out of this intact. And of course, then there are the issues of women living in households where they are the victims of domestic abuse, and how this lockdown has forced them to be living with their abusers. So it has been very difficult for women. I think that men are suddenly seeing all of the ways that women tend to hold up the households that tend to be ignored. Who does the laundry, who does the shopping, who does the cooking, who does the cleaning. Even in more modern families, the burden is predominantly on the women. And so this has brought that out in a very difficult way. I think it also means that a lot of couples have had marital problems, difficulties in their relationships, because these extra burdens do put a strain on relationships, and particularly on the women.
And so one of the consequences of the lockdown is it's not just physical distancing. There is a social fragmentation if people are not able to gather directly together. To what extent do you think that impedes the building up of a momentum of a popular opposition to the kind of eugenic policies that some of the states are implementing?
Well, first, I must say that for many people, it's actually been a time of coming together as a family, that people have found that they've never spent so much time with their children. They've never had a chance to really spend time quality time with their partners. So for those who have been in a situation where they're locked down with their family members, there are some positive things to this as well. But in terms of building up a response, there also have been creative ways to build movements during this time. I've had a chance to reach out to organizations and activists and leaders in movement that I have never had a chance to do before, to reconnect with people that I haven't been in touch with for a long time, to build coalitions that we have not had before. So those are some positive things of giving us the, quote, extra time of being in our homes to reach out. These webinars, I think, have been extraordinary ways to get to know the thoughts of different leaders that have the potential, when we feel that we are coming out of this pandemic, to be leaders in new movements to try to reshape the ways that our economic system should be dealing with all of these problems in our society. So yes, it is difficult if you can't go out on the streets and protest, which is what I'm used to doing, or can't go into the halls of Congress to protest. But there are other ways, and we are creating the foundations for what needs to happen when we can safely leave our homes.
Perhaps I can get you to comment on this morning, an article by James K. Galbraith. Just take a couple of sentences which towards the end of this article. He says, disaster capitalism is being tried, and the worst case is now the likely case. But there is a scale beyond which disaster capitalism cannot go. At a certain point, the carnage becomes too great to neglect, impossible to avoid, and lethal to overlook. At a certain point, ordinary people will stand up and refuse to be bullied anymore. That point is not quite arrived. We are still in the mindset of getting back to normal, even as the pandemic continues. Are we still in that moment of thinking we're going back to some kind of normal, or are we in a state of rebellion?
In the U.S., I think, unfortunately, some of the rebellion has been people demanding that our economy open up too quickly. And those of us who feel that this isn't the right time have been trying to set an example by not being out on the streets. But I do see it happening already in other countries, in places like Lebanon, where people say, we can't eat, in places like Iraq, where people are out again on the streets as they were before the lockdown. There are places now in Latin America where people are already getting out. I've had friends from Bolivia show me videos of people being out in the streets again. This is happening in Hong Kong, quite a wealthy society where people are feeling, in that case, that the pandemic has, for the most part, been conquered, and they're feeling safer coming out on the streets again. But I think we're going to see tremendous recessions, depressions economically in places around the world, and that is going to force people out on the street to demand a different kind of economic policy. Right now, we have countries that are already indebted that are getting perhaps a reprieve in terms of several months in paying back those debts. But that's not going to be nearly enough to deal with the kind of economic catastrophe that many countries around the world are going to be facing. And so I think it might be that the United States is a bit delayed in this kind of response of people out on the streets demanding real change. But it is certainly happening already in countries in many different places around the world, from Africa to Latin America.
Last week, I had a conversation on this program with Phyllis Bennis from IPS. at the Institute of Policy Studies in DC. And the point that she was making is that the pandemic has enabled attention to be drawn only to that in the newspapers and away from the continuing war that is happening in the Middle East. Do you see the same framework? Do you see that there is attention away from that, allowing the regime to continue its destructive policies?
Certainly, there's been very little room to talk about anything but domestic effects of this pandemic. And it has allowed the Trump administration to keep its terrible policies overseas. But it hasn't stopped the effects of these policies. In fact, they've become even harsher on countries like Iran, where the economic sanctions are even more brutal during this time of a pandemic. It hasn't stopped the U.S. attempts to overthrow the government of Venezuela, where we just see the most incredibly botched raid by those who would like to see regime change and perhaps get the $15 million bounty that the U.S. has put on the head of President Maduro. The U.S. continues its terrible policies towards Cuba at a time when that small island is showing the rest of the world what can actually be done when you have a country that has put a lot of its small amount of resources into building up a healthcare system and training so many doctors and nurses that they're not only able to deal quite well with the pandemic in the island itself, but to send dozens of brigades around the world to fight this pandemic in wealthier countries like Italy, as well as poor countries throughout Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. So we do have the continued U.S. war making, but we also have an exposure to the rest of the world that they can't look to the U.S. for leadership, certainly not during this time when the Trump administration is cutting off funds to the World Health Organization, is more interested in scapegoating China than in actually working together to find solutions. So for those who thought that in times of crisis, the U.S. could provide leadership as the global superpower, certainly that myth has been debunked for the world to see.
Indeed, indeed. But so we're now entering a period would normally be a lead up to the presidential elections. How do you see this playing out, given people are locked down, people are concerned about the issues that are immediate in relation to COVID, and where a sufficient radical alternative seems to have been lost at this point? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, it's devastating that our alternative to Trump is Joe Biden. He's hawkish when it comes to foreign policy. He won't even embrace the need for a Medicare for all system in the United States. I think for his campaign, perhaps it's a blessing in disguise that he can't get out on the campaign trail because they're afraid of what he'll say when he opens his mouth and goes off track. Which he does constantly. I think it's quite ironic that some of the polls show that he's ahead of Trump because Trump is in the public eye, making terrible blunders that have caused the death of tens of thousands of people in this country, while Joe Biden is in his basement for the most time staying mum. And maybe this can go on for quite some time, but at some point, there has to be more of a political contest going on. And I'm afraid to hear what Joe Biden will say if he is in a situation where he is actually debating Trump. In any case, we do have to get Trump out of the White House. And I hope with all the faults in the candidate of Joe Biden, at least we would have more of an ability to influence a Biden administration than we would a second term of Donald Trump.
Biden's staying mum. I wonder what the etymology of that particular expression comes from. But some have said that because what Trump appears to be doing is to playing to his political base, and apparently very effectively. And some people say that if he doesn't get in, there will be an outbreak of some kind of civil war. What's your view of that?
It's so hard to predict because it is hard to think that Trump would just step aside without a fight. His base, certain people within his base, are extremely violent or potentially violent. A lot of them armed and like to bring their weapons to their demonstrations. I am worried about what is going to happen in these elections, and it isn't too far-fetched to think that Trump will declare himself the victor, even if he is not. This is something that we have to organize for and prepare for and get people ready to take to the streets, not for a one-day demonstration on a weekend, not for a two-day demonstration, but for ongoing demonstrations that will make this country ungovernable and force him to leave the White House.
But given the scale of deaths as a result of COVID, given the threats that are being faced by very large sections of the population, especially the Black, Latinx, and so on populations, and the threats faced by women, many of whom are on that front line, isn't this the time to begin organizing for something that Code Pink is so well known for, and that's just an opposition, a refusal to carry out what the Indians call satyagraha, to say, no, we will not cooperate? Or do we have to wait till later?
It's very hard. We have been trying. It's hard to get people to even think in those terms right now because they're still living in fear around this pandemic. They're worried about the opening up of the economy and what that's going to mean. People who have children are worried about the children. People who are elderly are worried about their own health. It's a very difficult time to get people to focus on what could happen come November. But you're right, it has to happen. We are part of coalitions like the Poor People's Campaign, like different coalitions that came out of the Occupy movement, calls for third parties that are having webinars in which many hundreds of people are participating. There are groupings of people who were involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign who are getting together. There are organizations like Democratic Socialists of America having these discussions. So these are going on in various places, but I think it's going to have to wait till we get closer, at least into the fall, and people get more of a sense that these elections are imminent and that we're going to have to really have a plan in place for a person in the White House that refuses to leave.
But at the same time, elections are never going to solve this. To what extent? That's okay. To what extent are the elements of creating that new world? Arundhati's point about us entering a portal. What are the elements of that, and to what extent has the recent announcement yesterday of the Progressives International, how will that contribute to this on the ground organizing?
The different groups that are coming together, I think, are coming up with economic policies, foreign policies. We just released a letter yesterday by 50 different organizations saying the kind of foreign policy that we wanted, whether it was from Joe Biden, who it was addressed to, or a Trump administration. These are foreign policies that would make us safer in the world. There's certainly a lot of effort that has already been put into the Green New Deal and what that would look like. So I think we are using the time well in terms of trying to shape what are the economic and political and social kinds of institutions that we need. In terms of getting the large numbers of people, I've been in the U.S. and part of the Occupy movement. I've been in Tahrir Square during the uprising in Egypt. I've been in uprisings in Lebanon and many other countries. What you need is the spontaneity of the moment that calls people out, as well as the organizations behind the scenes who are able to capture that moment and turn it into some positive direction. So I think we are developing those institutions that are now behind the scenes, but creating that kind of container that could move a more large-scale mass movement forward. We have to see how some of these can work together. The faith-based organizations working together with the youth movement, working together with the anti-racist groups, all of this will be difficult to bring together, but I feel that we are creating the basis for that. If you look just at how many people came out during the Sanders campaign and the organizations that are still functioning from that, one called Our Revolution that has branches in cities all over the country and that continue to organize well. And that's just one organization. So I feel that we have a lot of these branches that could come together to form a more solid trunk of a tree that could give us the kind of foundation that we need. And as we come out of this, as we see what happens during the summer months that lead us into the fall, which is when the majority of the campaigning will be happening.
All right. Well, and the second point was in relation to the formation of this Progressives International. Is that something that that Code Pink will be involved with?
We are very excited about the Progressives International. We are excited about any attempts to link us up with people in different parts of the world. We've been involved in the World Social Forums that were taking place from India to Kenya to Venezuela and Brazil. We'll be involved in this international space. There are new spaces that are coming together in Latin America, and we are part of a new campaign called a Good Neighbor Policy to try to redirect U.S. policies towards that region. So all of these ways that bring us together with people from the rest of the world is so important to us, especially when we need inspiration now from each other, and when there are governments in place in some places like Iceland that is going to be the host for this, really give us hope. And certainly there are going to be mass movements all over the world to say we were totally unprepared for this pandemic and there will be future pandemics. We have to have systems in place that allow for us to deal with these in ways that don't devastate the poor, devastate the quote essential workers, and that don't devastate our economies, and don't put us in situations that allow us, like is happening here in the United States, to have during this pandemic bailouts where Wall Street companies get money from the taxpayers, where weapons companies like Boeing get money from the taxpayers, where fossil fuel companies get money from the taxpayers. So we have to make sure we have new systems in place for a new world order.
Medea, as always, you are always inspiring and one of the people who I think helps to shelter hope, because that's what we need in these times. I'd like to thank you really so much for sparing time to join us here on organizing in the time of COVID. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you and your viewers. Take
Okay,
care.
great. You take care. Look after yourselves and enjoy your family while you can.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. That was the inspiring Medea Benjamin, who has, as I said, been a source of immense hope for many people. And um, if you would like to know more about the work um, uh, of Code Pink, you should visit their website, which I have now just here. We are. There's Medea holding up a banner on Code Pink. So do look them up, and thank you for being on the show today. We will be interviewing Riaz Tayob tomorrow from South Africa to talk about the economic impact of COVID on African countries and the potential ways out of that. So please join us tomorrow afternoon. This is Firoz Manji signing off, and thank you for joining us today.